I'm excited to be here. I just flew in from Detroit. I spent 4 days in Detroit and Flint. I'll be here tomorrow. Next week, I'm off to Atlanta, all of which has given me a lot of new touch points. You know, I admit I sit in a bubble in DC, bubble, 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 and I'm usually very happy to be in that bubble because so when that bubble bursts, it's really scary. Um, I'm a mom of two kids in DCPS schools, and also spent significant time on Capitol Hill and in the Obama administration. Worked for the Century Foundation, and was super. Um, I have been really proud to follow in some amazing, shoes. Katie Haycock, our founder, nearly 30 years ago. Bodacious is like the only word I can think for her. Just without a doubt, always about the kids, not letting anybody, get away with saying, "Oh, everybody's doing great." But when you looked at the data, as she did, in school districts across the country, Black children, Latino children, children with disabilities, homeless kids, were not doing great, right? Their status, their performance, they were told, stay home on test day, no, we can't accommodate your wheelchair or the fact that you're blind and give you any other supports. So Katie did an amazing job really just elevating the power of data in making the case. And she did that for a number of years at the federal level. And also began what, she just must have been really thinking ahead of her time, acknowledging that states themselves, not just the federal government, but states had a role to play in all this because they were closer to students. They themselves, they control 90% of the dollars. The feds only control 10% of it. So they had a role. And Katie started EdTrust California, EdTrust West, EdTrust Michigan, which has been around for 20 years now. And then when John came on, he too recognized the power, John King, after he left as Secretary of Education, and recognized the power of states and what they could do. And during his time, we were really excited to have bold leadership in our New York office that really planted seeds and started the same journey that Katie did. Look at the data. How are our kids doing in the city? How are they doing in Rochester? How are they doing across New York? And really began to tell the story that New York could do better. New York could do better by its students. And we've had super bold leadership here, and I'm so glad that Arlen has taken full charge of what's going on here. And, she brings with her deep, deep knowledge of what goes on in New York. She worked for the New York State Department of Education. She has worked on behalf of English language learners, immigrant children. She walked many halls where people would duck when they saw her coming because they didn't want to have to explain why kids weren't performing, right, to her. So we're so excited for her leadership, her team that she has gathered together. In the very short time, New York has only been in EdTrust world since 2016. But, in that, we're almost going to be at, oh my God, 10 years. At 10 years, the number of things that they have led the charge on, bills that they have passed, relationships they have made. What's the number? You gave me a number, Arlen, on the number of bills that you guys had.
16.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
the poverty tax, doing child care awareness, and really building up a coalition to support our babies, our youngest kiddos, but also focusing on the other end. What are we doing about high school attainment? What are we doing about higher education persistence? This is the call. that we are about at EdTrust, and I just couldn't be happier that Arlen is with us. She is also going to share with us the impact. You guys all have books on our chairs. Impact is a funny thing in our world of policy and advocacy. It takes a while to move policy, because when you're moving policy, you're having to move people. And as we all know, people are funny things, you know? They're they don't always follow. They have to be pushed. And particularly when it's something they don't want to acknowledge or that they're uncomfortable with, right? And so that role that Arlen has had, that New York has had under EdTrust, has been about pushing leaders in high places, governors, school district leaders, State Department of Ed, the Board of Regents, to call them to question on why they aren't doing the right things by kids. Of late, Arlen has picked up the banner on state funding formula, school funding formula, that we're really excited about, because EdTrust has been engaged in those battles. Not just we want more money, but we want to spend it well. Like the more money thing, I'm not always about, unless we are going to spend it on evidence-based solutions, that we're going to spend it in a way that spreads equitable resources, not equal resources, but equitable resources. And Arlen is in that fight. Again, child care campaigns also in that fight. Making sure that, and I call this when children are seen. You cannot, if you are not capturing data on kiddos, you are not seeing them. So she's making sure that they are seen. And when you look at this report, and she's also going to do a data walk for those who want to participate, and I'm very excited to participate. We'll do that later. I'm just thankful for you, Arlen. Thank you for answering the call. Thank you for being a good partner. And the fact is, education broadly is facing some real challenges, from 1600 Pennsylvania to Senate leadership, the House leadership, really questioning why the federal government should be involved in education. And let's all remember why that was. Because states were not doing the job. States were not making sure kids were seen. States were not supporting children with disabilities, homeless children. That's why the federal government got involved. We know what's happened in the past. We're also not defending the status quo, but we know we can all do better. And that's what Arlen's about. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
All right. So everyone, I want to say something because I just heard this, but Arlen was named after a Latina revolutionary. Mm-hmm. That's the warning. Okay?
No pressure, no pressure.
We're just going to have a chance to chat a bit so we could get a little bit more into the data. I'm just going to start right in. So thinking about your first year at EdTrust-New York, what inspired you about the mission to take this on? I mean, talk to me about that.
Okay.
Because, not everyone says, advocacy, great, I'm going to fund that right now.
We'll have
but it's actually pretty important.
Yeah, well, got revolutionary roots, born in Cuba, raised in San Francisco, transplanted to New York, I've been here for about 20 years now. I am passionate about public education personally. I grew up in public schools in San Francisco. I went to a public university, and public school was a space where I could escape abuse and neglect in my home and be seen and thrive. And that was not true for so many of my friends and peers. And so saw the power of education to change lives and the reality that it doesn't do so for so many kids who need it the most. So that has always driven my passion for education. If there's a revolution we need, it's in the education space. I'm a parent now of New York City public school students, so it's personal for me. I have an amazing school that our kids go to. My partner Danny's here. Our kids go to an amazing public school in Washington Heights where they are participate in the Spanish bilingual program, learn our heritage, our language, learn our culture, the culture.
How old are they?
They're 6 and 10.
Still yummy still.
So it's personal for me. Like our school system needs to work so that my kids can be successful in our school system. And I realize that like a lot of people don't have access to that amazing type of school. And so I feel personally driven to increase access and the availability of those types of programs and services in New York City public schools and statewide.
Yeah.
So that's a personal perspective. I will say I'm an advocate. 15 years ago, worked as an advocate at Advocates for Children in New York City.
Yes.
And I was like, you know what we need is a statewide organization that focuses on racial equity and socioeconomic equity in our public school system. We have a lot of groups that focus on specific populations, but don't have that like vision. And I think EdTrust National, under Denise's leadership and John's leadership, brings that very clear. Like the racial equity is the thing that we're working towards. And so was just so excited about the opportunity to be part of an organization like that. I think we at EdTrust-New York have some unique stuff. We've been working on our theory of change this year, so we have a consultant that said, what's your special sauce? So we spent some time thinking about that, and some of it is our data work. So a lot of times I remember working on policy that wasn't data-driven, wasn't research-based. We would have big ideas that maybe were good or maybe not. We don't know. We don't have the data to like back up and decide whether that's the right thing to do. So something that I'm so proud of that we do at EdTrust-New York is we do the quantitative data. We ask the state agencies for the information. We disaggregate it by different subgroups. We match that with qualitative data, looking at interviews with educators, focus groups, parent polls, surveys, all kinds of information to really have a fully informed position before we take a policy recommendation or decision. So that's one of the things I love at EdTrust-New York. Another thing is that we don't work alone. We work in partnership. Everything we do is in partnership. We have 2 statewide coalitions, and Equity Coalition, a Raising New York coalition that focuses on early childhood. We also have a literacy campaign that we run. We also work with parents and students directly, those who are most impacted by any policy decision we're making. So we have a training program where we train them on advocacy. We train them on elevating their voice and telling their stories, and get them to be in the room with policymakers to have the people who are most directly impacted by the work directly there.
So interesting, because I think when I think about the work of the EdTrust, I think the number one thing is the partnerships, right? And some of the things for folks here to know in New York, just the work you did on English language learners and disparities in literacy rates was phenomenal, right? It revolutionized, I would say, a lot of the providers, particularly in bilingual communities or multilingual communities who really use that data. I also say the work that came out regarding student debt. I mean, I love it when, you get someone like an Elizabeth Warren quoting your data, right? And we were happy for Elizabeth Warren was on that, right? But I say that because I think that's important too, that thinking about you're a K through college model of policy and advocacy. So you really think across the full range of that.
Right.
You also did some incredible work on thinking about the implications to have Pell lifted, particularly for those who are incarcerated. So, and whatever happens national, it works with the local. And then you did some incredible work with math scores locally, right? So I just want to, so this is like what I think about EdTrust. I think about the work that you do that is scholar-friendly and practitioner-friendly. It reminds me of one of our groups, Cara. It's right there too. That does this. You've used their work before too, right? Absolutely. And they do incredible research too. So I want to add that because that's a true organizer's mindset.
Right.
That doesn't come by chance.
Right.
You don't come from the competitive space, you come from this collaborative space that I think is wonderful. When you're thinking right now about EdTrust, what is that one piece, it could be policy-wise, it could be something that is a particular opportunity for you, and then something that's really that kind of challenge or obstacle you're managing?
Yeah. So I know Denise talked about this before. We are an organization that tries to be flexible, so we have long-term things that we're working on that we're constantly trying to drive towards, and then we are aware of the political moments that we're in and how to take advantage of that. So when Governor Kathy Hochul said, we're going to look at the school funding formula. It was not a thing we were planning to work on, but we were like, let's become experts on the school funding formula. It is the most archaic and convoluted formula that exists in the country, which we learned because we have EdTrust National and our partnership to be able to tell us, hey, what you're doing in New York is not normal. Other states are doing something different.
Because remember, we just started getting people.
We just funded the formula.
We
so
just funded it.
That's a great first step, 18 years later. And then, so we thought, great, this is an opportunity to look at the formula. Is it driving the funds to the students who need it the most? Are we doing this right in New York? And so just became experts in that, used our data, came up with, like, I thought, really smart recommendations that we got from EdTrust National, sort of saying, look at poverty concentration. Don't just fund students who are experiencing poverty, but look at the concentration of poverty and how are schools that are providing those wraparound services that we know are expensive, like how are they getting funding to do that work? So we really went all in on the school funding formula, and we're in the middle of the budget season right now. Up in Albany every week. I have a ring and I get my steps in every time I go to Albany. We're knocking on doors and going to meet with everybody and really pushing for let's make this formula even more equitable and drive funding to the students who need it the most. And I think, as Denise said, we're one of the few organizations that's saying, let's not just drive the funding, let's see if it's actually getting the kids who need it. And so we have a school funding data tool that we do, and what we learn.
The accountability.
Exactly, and what we learn is like, we're not actually doing that. So our outcomes are not a surprise when you look at the spending side of things, of where is the money going? It's not going to multilingual learners, even though it's more weighted in the formula to drive funding for those students. So thinking about the accountability and transparency angle of it. And I will say, a lot of times when we say that in spaces, people are like, no, you just give the money, you don't care about where it goes to, that's the responsibility of the system, and that's fine. And we're one of the few voices in the room that says, no, that's not fine.
Guess what? You get to piss off both sides of the aisle.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what it means, right?
Exactly.
I mean, at the end of the day, that's what, there you go. And I mean, that means you're doing your job too. And I mean, I would say one of the things I always think that people always think New York is this kind of progressive haven.
Yes.
I mean, I just, like, I try to remind people, everyone used to stand up and wait online for hours to vote. Until recently, like you can't imagine.
And we had the old machines.
Like early voting, I'm just like, what is this revolution that hit everyone else many decades ago, and we just joined? So I could just imagine with education right now, and this is going to be a much more interesting question because it's about much more is going to be devolved to the states.
Yes.
So if the challenge of transparency is the lack of decision-making visibility, irrespective of who's in power, that change is just going to worsen that situation, right?
Right.
All right. So when you think about, you know, you haven't talked about it, but I mentioned it earlier about fundraising as a challenge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an opportunity too. We're in an interesting time where funding advocacy could be the hardest thing, or it could be the best thing right now, right? I mean, you're in this interesting moment of how people feel that they want to respond to maybe these radical shifts that we're experiencing. Talk to me about that.
Yeah.
How large is the organization? What's your vision for the organization right now?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I know there's a lot of nonprofit folks in the room, so we're experiencing all of this together. During the pandemic, there was an understanding from the funding community that there needed to be flexibility to respond to this constantly evolving crisis. Democrat came in power, stabilized things under Biden, and foundations were like, okay, now we want to shift to thinking about long-term change and project-based funding and not necessarily having that nimble and flexibility. And here we are again in a crisis. And so it's a challenging conversation to have with funders right now to say, you know, that report that you wanted us to do on like access to college courses in high school is really important, but like what's also important is that the Trump administration is threatening to raid schools. So we need to respond to that and do work on that. And so that's been a challenge right now of like negotiating those conversations. And you know, the funder community is also afraid. Everybody's a target right now, right? So we've had conversations with people not wanting us to mention students of color, like not a thing that's gonna happen at EdTrust, National EdTrust-New York. So sort of working with them as they figure out how to meet this moment and figure out how to push in and how do we create flexibility.
You know, it's interesting because for those of us who've worked on both sides of the Beltway in some ways, right? Like there is this pragmatist approach, but then there is this slippery slope of anticipatory compliance, which is really dangerous, right? And we have to really, this is why I love multi-generational workspaces, because, you know, not for all, but many younger people remind us this isn't norm. We don't want this, and we need to push back a little bit. And how do we figure this out? You know, so I appreciate that.
And like, and the multi-generational, I think, also helps us realize, like, we've actually been in some of these spaces before. Unfortunately, you know, I grew up in.
Oh, that's on both sides. Absolutely.
Right? Like, I grew up in California, Prop 187. Half of my class stopped going to school because they were worried about being deported in school. So like, we've actually unfortunately been here before, and like, what's our muscle
80s,
memory?
Between 80s crack and AIDS, right? Like, think about that in New York. Like, we really were. I mean, people were just dying, right? Like, you kind of, when you put all that into perspective. So what are some of your goals when you're thinking about fundraising? Like, what do you want to see?
What's my dream on the
Put
fundraising?
it out there. Mira, put it on el aire, right? It has to be, right? Make it real. Put it out there. What are you thinking?
I mean, I honestly will say, like, we need an army now, right? Like, this isn't a small onslaught. Like, this is, the target on education is insane and real, and something I personally have never seen in my lifetime before. And it's not just a target on education, it's a target on equity specifically. So like that, and we've got folks who were planning for 4 years on what they were gonna do, and they're implementing their plan. So Project 2025 is real. I remember we did an event recently where a partner, Educators for Excellence, talked about Project 2025 said dismantle the Department of Education in a year. They've done it in 3 months. So the onslaught, you know, I don't want to be hysterical, but like, it's real. It's a real thing, you know.
Well, and I mean, I think this is where it's important to say too, there's some folks, you look at your organization, you make some decisions. Some things you can do and cannot do, right? Some of us may have to be more pragmatic in some way. You are about building the field of resistance. I mean, there's no other way of saying it, right? Like, I mean, there are organizations that cannot do that. This is where there's true collaborative work. I would love it, and I know I'm going to go a little off script, so we're just having our convo because you know what?
Who needs a script?
Who needs a script? But I want you to talk a little bit about, I'll say what some of my views are, but this idea of what is a dismantling of the Department of Education mean, right? Because there's some things there's some myth busting, but there are some other things that I think are, and if you want to talk about that a little bit, I actually think that'll be helpful for folks because I know this is going to be streamed and people need some of that language. So some of it is, one is the federal government hasn't been the largest funder. So the assumption that schools close their doors tomorrow is not true.
No.
Schools will stay open, right? But when the Department of Education was built, it was focused on saying we are going to look at the most marginalized and vulnerable young people, right? It decided not to be a curriculum, right? We're not France, we're not the EU, right? That's not what we chose to do. We chose to be in a protectionist role. So that's huge. On the higher ed side, we chose to do lending. It's a large bank. We functionally run mortgages for college, right? So those are the two things. What are the implications of those two things being stripped away?
Well, I will say I'm thankful that I'm in New York. I was at a national conference recently with other blue states who are in a deficit. And so the conversation they're having right now around school funding, to your point, like New York City Public Schools, 5% of the budget was federal. And so it's not going to break us. I mean, it's a big impact. I don't want to lie, I don't want to minimize it, but it's not going to break us. And we are in a position in New York to be able to actually push in. The governor, for better or worse, held on to a surplus. We've got a $32 billion surplus in New York, so we can invest in our state. And honestly, at some point, we give more money to the federal government than we get back. So if they want to really strip that down.
Fair share is a whole other conversation. And California would not want us to have it without them.
So there's that aspect of it. The higher ed threat is real, right? Like stripping Pell Grants, tying it to anti-DEI stuff, that affects people's lives, like the ability of students to go to college.
And turning over all lending to market rates, right? Just the exploitive part of that. That's real, right? So we talk about an affordability crisis. What does it mean to say we're going to the government backup lending, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge that that's about an access issue too.
Yeah, no, that's real and scary. And having a billionaire, two weird billionaires being in charge of like billions and billions of dollars in lending. Lending is like a scary moment, I will say, in this country. I will say New York, I think, needs to sort of wake up to that part of the conversation. The governor is very much wanting to do free community college for adults and doing it in a way that really sort of benefits more of the middle class than folks from low-income backgrounds. And so we're trying to lay the foundation and have those conversations. And unless you're doing emergency aid relief, unless you're providing support for folks that have housing insecurity, food insecurity, all that kind of stuff, their ability to go to college and persist in college is not real.
Or for those who already have an associate's but couldn't afford a bachelor's, why couldn't we add those 2 years on?
Yeah. No.
Right? I mean, this is another interesting question about if we know what those 2 years mean and the return on investment of your income, right?
Right.
Like, why could we only want to invest that in those first 2 years?
Right.
Just a thought.
We'll add that to the list of the agenda.
John, what's going on? No. Yeah.
And then I think for immigrant students, we're also thinking about applying for FAFSA. You know, like, is that a good idea for families from mixed status backgrounds? People are afraid, and they're legitimately afraid, and we want to support them to the extent that they feel that they can do that. But I wouldn't want to tell the federal government that my parent is undocumented. Like, that seems crazy right now. So we've been doing some work with like agencies to think about how do we decouple. Right now you have to apply to FAFSA to get the state tuition assistance program. And so how do we decouple that and make sure that that's not prohibiting people who don't feel comfortable applying for federal aid at this point. So I will say it's a very hard moment, obviously, that we're in, but I do feel good that New York has the ability.
And let's switch to, I mean, I felt like we had to say that, but just to dispel some of the myths out there, because, and then also what are the real fears, because they're real.
Right.
I mean, Denise and I were just talking earlier, the three of us, and Thursday and Friday are when organizations announce that they're going to be downsizing, right? And so we know quite a few national organizations that have made those decisions. That's what's happening now, so we know that. So it's very real for folks in the middle of an affordability crisis and all those things happening. But where is there opportunity? Because I truly believe this is a moment of opportunity, particularly for advocacy and organizers.
Yeah.
Like, this is yum. Not that you wish for that, you don't.
Right,
but
no.
I'm saying, like, tell me that and how EdTrust is filling that moment. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think so much of our work is in coalition and partnerships, and people are hungry and asking, like, what do we do? What could we be doing right now? And so one of the amazing reality of EdTrust-New York is having the national relationship, and our national team is saying, like, this is noise, don't pay attention to this. This is intended to confuse you, and this is real. Pay attention to this and think about this. And like, I think that really helps us be more on the forefront. So how are we thinking about oversight of our school systems? As the federal government is abdicating its responsibility, what are we doing in New York to say, we need to know how kids are doing? We had our NAEP scores come out earlier this year. 50% of Black and Latino students are not reading on grade level in grade 4. Like, we're not doing this right. We're not doing education right in New York State. And there needs, if the federal government is no longer in a position to have oversight and advocacy, and honestly that has weakened over the years, that's just a reality. What is New York State doing to say, we want to see what you're doing. What kind of instruction are you giving? We have a huge literacy campaign because turns out we've been teaching reading wrong for over 40 years. And so how are we actually teaching students how to read? So I think there's a role for state oversight, and I will say that's a new thing. It's not.
I want to say I was a phonics generation, so I just
you didn't experience that.
I didn't know, I really didn't, but my son did.
Yes.
And it delayed his reading until we had to move him to a phonics. I think it's an interesting question, especially when you do with young children. It was phonics that actually moved him.
Yeah.
Not whole language. I thought that was.
I was a parent during the pandemic. I watched my daughter being told, look at the picture and guess the word. And I was like, what is that? That's not reading. Yeah. I was lucky that I learned how to read in Spanish, which is all based on like syllables and phonics. And so I was able to try to teach her to read in Spanish. But there's been a shift in New York, and we're now doing New York City Reads in particular. We're doing that's aligned to the science of reading. And I've seen a difference in my son. He's reading. And we don't have to worry about it. We didn't have to do the level of intervention. So I think that there are clear things that we know work that we need to push forward and drive forward on. And then I do think we need to be in a protectionist mode of like, how are we protecting our immigrant community? I know in my children's school, there's a huge effort to fundraise things like putting a Ring camera on apartment doors to know if it's ice at the front door. Like, it's real. There's a real need to do the reactive stuff in addition to like pushing forward on the stuff that we know is good and right for kids. And teaching kids to read, let's do
think,
that.
Yeah, I do think one of the areas that's a study we have done too, but it's about migrant integration, right? It's not just where it happens as far as in the workforce and economic development, it's also in the schools. It's really sporadic, especially when children are moved from place to place. And for people to understand, when you're looking at 80,000 children, right? It's approximately 80,000 children. By the time families come here, they will have been out of school and on the road for 8 months already, right? You got to, they've lost more than a year, right? So, that looks different than other migration patterns that we've had.
Right.
And so we
100%.
haven't adapted to what does that look like integrating. So I'm excited. I'm hoping that you guys get to do some more on that. But I'm going to add one thing, and then I want you to walk us through a little bit of just, because I think it'd be interesting for folks to actually see some of the statistics and stuff. Is that okay for folks? So they could just walk away with some key points. Is that good? Yeah? All right. So you have a 3-year impact report, right? So I want to say this. I want you to talk about it. But one thing I want to say is never underestimate, I keep saying this. I don't talk about it in terms of parties, red, blue. I don't, because I have to say sometimes the biggest ed shifts we saw were under parties we didn't expect to see. I'm just being honest, right? So this is one of those it's like immigration. When did we see the biggest reforms happen? It's like, it's not as simple as you think, right? So for me, what I think is important is where my biggest fear is why I want you to talk about the 3-year report, is that how easy it is to decide you don't want to collect sub-ethnic data or do comparative data. Mm-hmm. And that can happen under a progressive or a conservative administration. And so your impact report's important because it holds folks accountable here. Right? Let me make it clear. I've seen people justify why we should keep kids in special ed because they got too tired to ask the parents, and so they would sign. No, we're not making this up. These are things that have happened. So it's actually really important that you talk about that report and how that's going to make sure that we keep the state accountable, because we're not going to have any kind of accountability at the federal level. And I also say too, we're also going to have interest from other states who realize they're not going to get that federal, right? So you never know what state you might influence in the middle of the country. So talk about
I love having a national impact if we can.
Yeah, Denise feels it, right? Tennessee is an interesting state. It's totally, half wants to see it, half does. I mean, this is a place where enormous organizing potential. Yeah. So 3-year impact report. Okay. Tell us about it.
So I'll talk. So our impact report sort of looked at the last 3 years and the work that we've been able to accomplish, and thinking about different categories of work, of the types of reports that we've been able to put out, legislative wins that we've been able to have, partnership and relationships we've built, how many folks we're working with. And so we have some banners outside that we'd love to do like a gallery walk a little bit to look through. And then really thinking about how do we build on that work. So something that we're dealing with, which is a good problem to have, is like we've won a lot of things, but a lot of it comes down to implementation and the effectiveness of implementation. So last year we won universal FAFSA, for example. So all students theoretically are now supposed to either apply for FAFSA or sign a waiver that they are not going to apply for FAFSA. There was no funding put towards that, and we can see in the data that we've been doing that there isn't an increase in FAFSA completion. And so what are we doing now to think about, like, it's not just about the policy win that you got, but how are you making sure that it's
unfunded man? It's
unfunded. Exactly. Yeah, unfunded mandate, and I will say for us, it's also unfunded. Some of our funders were like, "Great, you got universal FAFSA. We're not going to fund you to do FAFSA anymore." We were like, "Well, we need to make sure that the law actually works," and so that's definitely a challenge that we have and something that we're thinking about moving forward. And then the accountability piece is huge. I will say, we aren't a state that likes assessments. We have a huge opt-out movement. I'm gonna not look at my partner because we're currently having a battle in our home over this. My 10-year-old is advocating amazing self-advocacy skills to opt out of taking the state test.
Well, I mean,
it's real. It's real. Tests are, anyways, I get it from all angles.
Opt-out movement has gone across race and class lines.
100%.
It used to be what people would think this was just privileged, corner communities who can be isolated. Absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely not. So this is welcome to the world.
And I think, and it's hard because from an advocacy organization, like we need that data to be able to say, like,
is this working or not?
it's not working, you know, and it's particularly not working for the kids that we know it's not working for. It's not working for communities of color. It's not working for kids from low-income backgrounds. So we lose that data. We lose it at the national level with NAEP. That's pretty scary, you know. It undermines our ability to do advocacy at the state level. So it's a huge...
And also we can't do the comparative data either outside the state. So you only can look at the state. I don't think people realize how much of a loss that is because there is no national push for that.
Yeah.
You know, unless a state decides, well, if I do it, and do they want to show those numbers?
Right.
Share them,
And we see the gap. The national numbers show that 50% of Black and Latino students are not reading on grade level. The state data says 30%. So when you do the comparative, it's actually even worse than what we thought it was at the state level. So not having that national is really hard.
And then the other part about EdTrust is you go down to district. Right. So I think this part is important too, because aggregate could be a game that we've all played too. Right. And that's when you actually look and say, oh my goodness. I also say when you go down to school data, but that's a whole other thing, because you know which teacher's not teaching reading well, and you know which one is. It's literally that granular. So I thank you for that work, because it's not that kind of self-eval is never going to be public.
No, people don't want to be held to that level of accountability, but it's important. So.
All right, so we get to hear a little bit of a gallery. What can we thank Arlen for?
Thank you.
Giving us a taste.
Thank you to you, Lisette, for hosting us and having this wonderful event.
Walk us through some key data points so people can walk away with like holding on to that.
So we have some banners outside that have some key data points. There's also in the impact report that you have on your chair. We have some sticky notes if you want to engage at EdTrust-New York. We like to do interactive data work. So have some questions if you want to think about how does this relate to the work that you do? What insights does this give? What questions do you have? Any advice of work that you think we should be doing to keep pushing this forward? So I invite you all to do that. And
can I make a request of you too?
Yes.
We could assume that we're probably not going to get a lot of Title I funding.
Yes.
Can you pull together a group to talk about what would that mean?
Yes.
And the disproportionate impacts. No, I'm really serious about it, because that is huge. And it is highly in certain zip codes, right? So I think it's actually really important to get that. What does that mean? Because I think a lot of people need to be armed with that data to make the arguments.
Yes, and I think that like also helps us say to the state, you need to kick in.
We need you to kick in here.
We need you to kick in.
Not say that you're going to kick in everywhere. Equally, right? No, I know that game.
Some districts don't need the money.
Right?
Some districts do not need the money.
But I think that's really. See, well, I did my own lobbying and advocacy work there. I'm going to end on that note. Thank you, Arlen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you.